All right, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Stephanie Fahuri, and I'm the director of the Cancer Legal Resource Center. And today we are going to go over some of the basic things that you might want or need to know about clinical trials. Really quickly, for those of you who aren't super familiar with us, the Cancer Legal Resource Center is a program of the Disability Rights Legal Center. We're based in Los Angeles, California. And our mission is to provide information and resources on cancer-related legal issues to cancer patients, survivors, caregivers, healthcare professionals, employers, and others coping with cancer. We follow an education model, which generally means that we do not provide direct legal advice or legal representation, but all of our services are available free of charge. The CLRC also maintains a library of fact sheets and handouts and publications on a variety of cancer-related legal issues on our website, including a resource that we call our Patient Legal Handbook. We are actually gearing up to release the second version of our handbook, which has been updated for 2018. And we couldn't have done so without the help of our generous sponsors, Breakaway from Cancer and the American Cancer Society. If you're interested in downloading a copy of our Patient Legal Handbook, feel free to go to our website, cancerlegalresources.org. If you work for a hospital or other cancer organization, you can also do a bulk pre-order on our website. So we have an order form on there. I'm going to do my best to leave some time for questions. I'm going to be covering quite a bit of material today. If I'm not able to answer your question, if I don't know the answer, or if we run out of time, please know that you can also reach out to us through our online intake form on our website at clrcintake.org. Or if you want to pass along the information to someone who maybe doesn't have internet access, they can always leave us a message at 866-THE-CLRC. So let's dive right in here. I want to give a little overview of some of the things that we're going to cover today. So first, I'll be going through Clinical Trials 101, sort of the basics, covering sort of why we need clinical trials, what the different phases are that they go through, other ways that, they have the other hoops that people potentially have to jump through. And then I'll be talking a little bit about insurance coverage for trials. And then I'll wrap things up going over some alternative ways to access experimental treatment outside of clinical trials. Okay, so why are clinical trials important? Why are we even having this conversation or presenting this webinar? Cancer clinical trials have led to some serious scientific advances that have helped to increase doctors' understandings of how and why tumors develop and grow, and clinical trials have contributed to doctors making progress in preventing cancer, diagnosing cancer, finding cancers that have come back after treatment, etc. And clinical trials remain the most reliable and only accepted scientific method to find out if a new treatment works better than the current standard of care. Even though clinical trials offer a lot of promise, unfortunately, currently less than 5% of adults with cancer enroll in them. This low level of participation can slow progress and development of new, more effective therapies, and that's part of why I want to share this information with you today. Just as an example of why clinical trials are important or how they can impact people's lives, there's a recent example that was in the news just a couple weeks ago. Results from a recent trial involving breast cancer patients has determined that 70% of women, 70% of women with early stages of the most common form of breast cancer don't need chemotherapy. The results from this clinical trial will impact women worldwide and will hopefully improve their quality of life and reduce medical debt and time away from work and family. So that's just one example of how a clinical trial can really not only provide scientific advances, but can really impact people's lives in a meaningful way. So first things first, what exactly is a clinical trial in the first place? A clinical trial is a research study designed to find out if new treatments, drugs, or procedures are safe and effective. Some people are afraid of the uncertainty of new treatments, but clinical trials often provide patients with access to high-quality care and treatments before they become available. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that if you have questions that come up, or if for some reason you're not able to hear me, please feel free to type a question in the chat box, and I'll be checking that periodically throughout the webinar. So many clinical trials evaluate new treatments to find out whether they're safe, maybe better than the current standard treatment, but there are a lot of different types of clinical trials. Some of them might try combinations of existing treatments, new approaches, new types of surgeries. There's also clinical trials that study ways to ease symptoms or side effects, and then ongoing studies also about ways to prevent cancer. So clinical trials can cover a pretty broad range of the continuum of care. Unfortunately, testing drugs or new treatments, or lack thereof, on humans has a dark history, and a lot of people are wary of clinical trials because of this history. For example, there was some pretty horrific experimentation on humans that took place during World War II, like at concentration camps by Nazis and on Chinese civilians and other prisoners of war by Japan's Unit 731. Another example is the now infamous Tuskegee study, which was a clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the U.S. Public Health Service. The purpose of that study was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in rural African American men in Alabama, but it was done under the guise of receiving free health care from the U.S. government. None of the men infected were ever told that they even had the disease, and none were treated with penicillin, even after the antibiotic was proven to successfully treat syphilis. So that was pretty horrific. Another example, you may have read the book or seen the movie about Henrietta Lacks. She was an African-American woman whose her cancer cells are the source of the HeLa cell line, which was one of the most important cell lines in medical research. As was the practice, no consent was given when they obtained a culture of her cells when she was at the hospital at Johns Hopkins, and neither she nor her family were compensated for their extraction or use. And HeLa is continued to be, it is still used today. So these days, thankfully, there are a lot more safeguards in place to protect patients. Researchers have to go through a lengthy process in order to get the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to give permission to test new drugs on humans. So before a clinical trial can be started, the research has to be approved, and by doing so, someone has to submit an investigational new drug or IND application or request. And it has to be filed with the FDA when research wants to study a new drug in humans. The IND application has to contain certain information about potentially preclinical studies, which would be the results of studies, including those on animals, which would allow the FDA to decide whether the product was reasonably safe for testing in humans. They would also potentially have to provide the manufacturing information, so information about how the drug is made, who makes it, how stable it is, what's in it. And then additionally, the investigator would have to share information about the clinical protocols and also information about the investigator, him or herself. So that would include detailed outlines for the clinical studies to see what the study might expose subjects to. There are unnecessary risks. They want information about the investigators themselves who will supervise the study to see if they're qualified to actually run clinical trials. And finally, the research sponsor has to commit to getting informed consent from the research subjects, which we'll talk about in a little while. So there are various committees and agencies that oversee patient safety before, during, and after a clinical trial. So first, the IRB, or Institutional Review Board. It's an independent committee of doctors, statisticians, community advocates, clergy, lawyers, and others who ensure that a clinical trial is ethical and that the rights and welfare of study participants are protected. Every clinical trial in the United States must be approved and monitored by an IRB to make sure the risks are as low as possible and that any risks are outweighed by potential benefits. All institutions that conduct or support medical research involving volunteers must, by federal regulation, have an IRB that approves the clinical trial before it begins and reviews the research periodically until it's completed. The federal agencies that provide some oversight are the FDA, as we've already mentioned, and the National Institutes of Health. The FDA and NIH are responsible for approving drugs and monitoring research. And then there's also the Data Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB. The DSMB is an independent group of doctors, statisticians, other health professionals that monitor a clinical trial for safety and scientific relevance throughout the study period. So a DSMB is especially useful for large clinical trials that are taking place in many locations because they'll review the data accumulated from all clinical trial sites. And one of the ways that the DSMB is different from an IRB, or an Institutional Review Board, is that the IRB usually looks at the clinical trial before it starts. They're looking to see, are the protocols in place, what does the informed consent form look like, etc., where the DSMB reviews the study after it starts and makes recommendations to the IRB about stopping or continuing the study. In addition to the regulatory safeguards in place for clinical trials, patients have certain rights when it comes to participating, or not, in a clinical trial. Patients are not always aware of their rights regarding trials, and so I really wanted to make sure that it's clear that you have the right not to participate at all, you have the right to information about the study, you have the right to informed consent, which we'll talk about in a minute, and you also have the right to ask questions and be given answers, and to drop out of the study if you start it. One of the most important protections for patients in a clinical trial is the idea of informed consent. Informed consent is more than just getting the patient to say yes or no to participation. It includes, as you can tell from the name, actually informing the patient about the pros and cons so that the patient can make a decision based on important information. So informed consent does include things like, what is the clinical trial set up to find out, what is expected of the patient, what are they going to need to provide or do in order to participate in the study. The research team should list all of the patient's options so that they understand what their available treatment choices are. The research team has to list all of the potential risks and benefits, if any, of the new treatment, which may or may not be different from the risks and benefits of the standard treatment. Additionally, the research team will have to explain, as I said, potential costs, how they will protect privacy for the study participants, and whom to contact with questions or concerns. They usually need to allow for time to ask questions, discuss with family and friends, and there should be an opportunity for ongoing communication. One sort of practical tip that we'll share here is that if you are looking to join a clinical trial and you're given a consent form, keep a copy of the consent form. Ask for a copy if one isn't offered to you. You can also request a copy of the full study plan, also known as a protocol, that describes all of the details of the clinical trial. So you can have that information, on hand in case questions come up. So now that you know some of the safeguards to starting a trial or enrolling patients, we're going to talk a little bit about the different phases that trials go through. Usually we just talk about phases 1 through 3, But there is also technically a phase 0 and a phase 4. So I'll touch on these a bit. So phase 0 clinical trials are basically an option to explore if and how a new drug may work. They're not used widely, and there are some drugs that it wouldn't make sense to do a phase 0 study for. Usually they're really small, and the purpose of this phase is to help speed up and streamline the drug approval process. Phase 0 studies are exploratory studies that often use only a few small doses of a new drug in a few patients. So they might be testing to see whether the drug reaches the tumor, how the drug acts in the human body, etc. And the biggest difference between phase 0 and the later phases of clinical trials is that there's almost no chance that the volunteer for a phase 0 study will actually benefit by taking part. The benefit will be for other people in the future. Because the drug doses are really low, there's also less risk to the patient in phase 0 studies compared to phase 1. So phase 1 studies, the first time testing on humans. So this is the first step in testing a new drug or procedures with people. And the researchers will test safe dosages and different ways of giving the drug. So, either maybe trying out whether it works better orally or through IV injection. And then the researchers carefully observe any side effects. So often for a phase 1 trial, you might need to stay overnight at the hospital so that they can provide adequate observation. And the purpose of phase 1 clinical trials is to learn how safe the drug or therapy is in people, find the best dose and schedule, and study how it might help treat cancer. So they might test, one a day, one dosage a day, multiple dosages, different, like I said, different ways of giving the medication. And really, with a phase 1 clinical trial, safety is the main concern. Doctors really keep a close eye on people, watch for serious side effects. But these studies are usually pretty small. Typically, only up to a few dozen people participate in a phase 1 trial. And phase 1 trials are the ones with the most potential risk. But they do help some patients. So, depending on your personal situation or the situation of your patient, the pros might outweigh the cons, and the potential benefits might outweigh the risks when it comes to participating in a phase 1 trial. So with phase 2, the study primarily focuses on safety and effectiveness. So if a trial is successful at phase 1 and the drug is shown to be safe enough, it will continue to phase 2. Like I said, they study the effectiveness and safety of the treatment and will evaluate how the drug or procedure affects your body. And one statistic that I think is pretty interesting is that about 70% of drug candidates go from phase 1 to phase 2. So only about 70%, or we can flip it and say about 30% of drugs that go through the phase 1 clinical trial process do not continue to phase 2. A couple of important points about phase 2 trials. Usually it's a group of 25 to 100 patients with the same type of cancer will get the new treatment. They're treated using the dose and method found to be safest and most effective in phase 1 studies. Because there's several more patients potentially participating in the phase 2 trial, there's a better chance that less common side effects will be seen. And if enough patients benefit from the treatment and the side effects aren't too bad, the treatment will then be allowed to go on to a phase 3 trial. Okay, some technical difficulties there. All right, so when we're talking about drugs that move on to a phase 3 trial, only 33% of drugs that pass a phase, or that go through phase 2 trial, move on to phase 3. So only a third. And then Another thing to keep in mind is that only 25 to 30% of drugs that advance to phase 3 are actually successful. So we might start out with a ton of drugs that researchers and clinical investigators want to study through the clinical trials process, but as the drugs go through these processes, many of them end up failing either because they are not effective, or they are too risky and cause too many side effects, or maybe they're just not as effective or more effective than the current standard treatment. So for phase 3 trials, they generally will compare the new treatment with the current standard treatment. Because doctors don't yet know which treatment is better, study participants are often picked at random, called randomized, to get either the standard treatment or the new treatment. When possible, neither the doctor nor the patient knows which of the treatments the patient is getting, and that type of study is called a double-blind study. Usually for phase 3 clinical trials, there are at least several hundred patients enrolled. They're more likely to be offered at community-based oncologists as opposed to maybe major health centers for some of the earlier phases. Okay. In the United States, when phase 3 clinical trials show that a new drug is more effective or safer than the current standard treatment, a new drug application called an NDA is submitted to the FDA for approval. The FDA then reviews the results from the clinical trials and other relevant information. If the drug is approved, the new treatment often becomes the standard of care, and then newer drugs in the future will then have to be tested against it before being approved. If the FDA feels that there's more evidence needed to show that the new treatment's benefits outweigh the risks, it might ask for more information or require that more studies be completed. So that's where potentially phase 4 clinical trials might come into place. So for phase 4, these trials research the long-term safety and overall effectiveness of treatment. These studies take place after treatment has already been approved for widespread use. Not all drugs go through phase 4. So a couple of key things to remember about phase 4 clinical trials is that these drugs have already been approved by the FDA. And this is typically the safest type of clinical trial because the treatment's already been studied a lot and might have already been used in a lot of people. So these types of studies look at safety over a long period of time. They might also look at other aspects of the treatment, such as quality of life, cost effectiveness, and you can usually get the drugs used in a phase 4 trial without actually enrolling in a study. So a lot of people want to know, okay, well, why, aside from potentially helping people down the road with these experimental treatments that might eventually help future patients and survivors, what exactly are these benefits? Why should I think about enrolling in a clinical trial? So some possible benefits associated with participating would be access to high quality care, close monitoring by doctors, and then of course, playing a role in improving future treatments. The other thing to keep in mind is that you might be the first to benefit from a new treatment or procedure. You might have access to a treatment that's not otherwise available, which might be safer or work better than the current treatment options. You might feel like you have more control over your situation and are taking a more active role in your healthcare. And additionally, some study sponsors may pay for part or all of your medical care and other expenses during the study. And we'll talk in a little while about insurance coverage of trials and how that all plays out. So on the other hand, there are a number of risks associated with participating in clinical trials. Certainly, the new treatment might not work. The treatment might cause terrible side effects. The new treatment might not be any better than the old one or the current standard. And another thing that maybe not everyone thinks about is that you might need additional tests or the clinical trial location might be such that it's very inconvenient. The additional testing might be uncomfortable, might be time consuming. A couple of other possible downsides is that, the unknown side effects or other risks. And if you take part in a randomized clinical trial, you might not have a choice about which treatment you get. So if a study is blinded, you and maybe your doctor won't know which treatment you're getting, although the information is available if needed for your safety. So if you're having some pretty serious side effects, they might be able to disclose that information so that you're able to get appropriate supportive care. Sometimes patients are concerned that if they participate in a clinical trial, they might get a placebo instead of actual treatment. A placebo is an inactive drug, sometimes referred to as a sugar pill. I have this image here on the slide of a birth control pack. Usually the last week in that birth control pack is a placebo. And some clinical trials called placebo-controlled trials compare a new treatment with a placebo, which is, as I said, an inactive drug. But the use of placebos alone in cancer clinical trials is really rare. They are pretty much only used when there is no effective standard treatment available, or they're given in addition to standard treatment. They're also given sometimes along with treatment to manage any symptoms or side effects as part of supportive or palliative care. And the research team will let participants know when a placebo is a possible option in a study. So now that you have a basic understanding of the process that a drug has to go through to be approved, the next hurdle is actually figuring out if and whether there are clinical trials that you might benefit from. The first place to start is with your doctor. So here are a couple of questions that you might want to ask to start the conversation about clinical trial enrollment or eligibility. You might want to know which trials are open to me. What are the risks and benefits? What are my other treatment options if I don't pursue a clinical trial? What's the purpose of the trial? How much will it cost me? And these questions, certainly are important to ask your doctor up front. But if you get to the point where you are looking into specific trials, these questions can and should also be asked as part of the consent or the informed consent process. Now, unfortunately, our doctors are not always aware of all of the trials that are available. There are new trials coming out, certainly maybe not every day, but all of the time. So often doctors are, unless they're at a research institution, a huge comprehensive cancer center, maybe your primary care doctor or doctors out in the community might not be as tuned in. So if they aren't, you do have some options for trying to research trials on your own. But I will say that some of these databases are not particularly user-friendly. So I offer you these options with the little bit of a warning that this might not be the easiest process to go through on your own without the assistance of your doctor or health team. So the first here is clinicaltrials.gov. It's part of the National Institute of Health. And this database of publicly and privately supported clinical trials is maintained by the National Library of Medicine at the NIH. It provides information about more than 100,000 studies involving patients that are researching a wide variety of diseases and conditions, including cancer, in all 50 states and more than 150 countries. So if you go on to clinicaltrials.gov, you can always search for cancer trials, or you can search for your specific type of cancer. Sometimes it'll say that the study is currently recruiting. Those are potentially the ones that you want to be looking for, as opposed to ones where recruiting is closed or the trial has been withdrawn. That information is usually pretty easy to figure out. We have the National Cancer Institute, NCI, clinical trials. The NCI is part of the National Institute of Health. They provide funding for most of the US cancer clinical trials. Then we have breastcancertrials.org. This is a nonprofit online service that helps users find breast cancer specific clinical trials that might be right for them. It offers study summaries, and each of these websites generally provides information about the study protocol, who the researchers are, contact information, etc. Then we have centerwatch.com. It's a publishing and information services company that offers a list of Institutional Review Board, or IRB, approved clinical trials. Emerging Med offers phone and internet-based service that identifies clinical trial options that match a patient's specific diagnosis, stage, and treatment history. And then if you're looking for trials for pediatric cancer, and I haven't really mentioned much about pediatric cancer patients because there's a huge percentage of children that are enrolled in clinical trials, and that's one of the reasons why we've made so many advances in treating pediatric cancers. Most pediatric cancer clinical trials are run through the Children's Oncology Group, so it's really the best place to search for pediatric cancer trials. So sometimes we hear from people who contact our hotline who ask us, why did I get rejected from this clinical trial? They want to know why. It seems like, based on what they were reading, that they should have been eligible. So unfortunately, there are strict rules about who can participate in each trial. Each clinical trial follows a set of rules called a protocol, which I've mentioned a couple times now. And it describes who can participate in the study and how the treatment will be given and monitored. So as part of this protocol, when clinical trials are set up, they have requirements about who can join. And these are called inclusion and exclusion criteria. Examples of criteria could be a person's age, the type of disease they have, medical history, and current health. So inclusion criteria, so who can or should be included, help make sure that all of the people in the clinical trial are medically similar. So if you have people in there that are in a really wide range of ages and a wide range of staging for their cancer, and maybe some of them have heart disease and some of them have liver issues, etc., it's going to be really hard to interpret that data afterwards because you might not know, did this person not benefit from the treatment because the treatment's not effective, or was it the result of their age or, some other treatment that they had already received, etc. So they really try to make it as narrow as possible so that people enrolled in the trial are, what's referred to as medically similar. Along the same lines, exclusion criteria can help keep people safe. So, for example, it's not often safe for patients with a severe heart condition or kidney failure to receive some cancer treatments, so they might be excluded from clinical trials as well. They're not used to reject, these exclusion criteria are not used to reject people personally, shouldn't ever be taken personally, but it's really to protect people from potential risks and increase what doctors and researchers can learn from each study. So for each trial that you're interested in, read the protocol summary. As I said, those are available if you're looking at the clinicaltrials.gov or some of those other websites trying to search for trials. The study protocol is available. It contains information about the purpose of the trial, the treatments being tested, and the locations where the trial is taking place. So sometimes a trial will be run only at one specific hospital. Sometimes, maybe depending on the phase that the trial is in, it might be being tested at multiple sites. So maybe you live in California and there's a trial that's being conducted in New York. It's possible that, if you look at the protocol, they might have other locations that are closer to you where you might be able to actually participate in the trial without having to travel. Much of the information in these study protocols is in medical language, so if you are having trouble understanding it, or even if you're even remotely considering enrolling in a clinical trial, you should still print it out and take it to your doctor to discuss with your doctor maybe additional pros and cons based on what they understand about your medical history. Okay, so now that you understand a little bit about what clinical trials are, how to enroll, where to search for them, some important questions to talk about with your doctor, you might be wondering what you'd have to pay to actually participate in one. So before the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010, many states had already set up their own state laws regarding insurance coverage for clinical trials. Some of them were limited to cancer clinical trials, while others applied to all types of approved clinical trials. However, once the ACA was passed, and when I say ACA, I am referring to the Affordable Care Act, also referred to as Obamacare, but when it was passed in 2010, it outlined many changes with respect to health insurance coverage generally, and specifically health insurance coverage with respect to clinical trials. So as part of the ACA, health plans or insurers cannot deny patients' participation in a clinical trial. They also can't limit or deny coverage of routine costs to patients who choose to participate in an approved clinical trial. And they also can't increase costs because a patient chooses to participate in a clinical trial. This basically means that your insurer cannot limit your benefits if you choose to enroll in a clinical trial. And this might seem pretty straightforward, but before the Affordable Care Act was passed, sometimes insurers or health insurance companies would actually deny a patient's participation in a clinical trial, or they would try to limit coverage based on that. Your health insurance provider might also require you to visit a doctor or hospital who participates in your health plan's network. If your health plan includes coverage for out-of-network services, the insurer generally has to cover your routine costs to care for an out-of-network trial. So I'll go into a little bit more about, what approved trials are and what routine costs are. So first, we're talking about approved trials. So a health insurance company, your health insurance policy will have to cover routine costs if you're enrolled in an approved trial. So an approved clinical trial is a study being done for the prevention, detection, or treatment of cancer or other life-threatening illness. And under the law, the clinical trial must be federally funded, have an investigational new drug, IND, application, or be exempt from IND requirements. However, your doctor or the study sponsor can certainly tell you whether the clinical trial you're considering would be covered under the ACA. So for federally funded, that basically means that the clinical trial is approved or funded by, for example, the National Institute of Health or the National Cancer Institute, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid services, etc. So federally funded. It might have to have an IND application. So researchers have to submit an IND application to the FDA. In many instances, to give the drug in clinical trials, your doctor or the sponsor of the clinical trial will be able to tell you if the trial has an IND requirement, or if the trial is exempt from an IND application requirement. This might happen if the research is not being done to request FDA approval for changes like changing the labeling, advertising a new use, testing a new dosage, or a new way to give the drug. So any of those things might mean that it's an approved trial under the Affordable Care Act. So one other thing to keep in mind here about clinical trials after the ACA is that there isn't preemption for more protective state laws. And what that basically means is that, under the US Constitution, federal laws, so laws passed by our Congress and Senate in Washington, D.C., generally are the law of the land. State laws generally are looked at second, federal law is looked at first. However, in this scenario, when it comes to clinical trial coverage for insurance, state law is what will govern if it's more protective to the patient. So there are currently 38 states that require health insurance plans to cover routine costs of the clinical trial. And the components of the laws vary significantly by state. So if you're curious about the law in your state, certainly you can reach out to the CLRC. But another really helpful resource is the American Society of Clinical Oncology, also known as ASCO. And their website is www.asco.org. Now, the reason it's important, potentially important, to understand state law coverage for routine costs of clinical trials is that if you have something called a grandfathered health insurance plan, the ACA protections might not apply to you. So really quickly, a grandfathered plan is a health insurance plan that existed before the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. So if you enrolled in a health insurance policy either on your own or through work, and that policy has been in existence since before 2010, you might be on something called a grandfathered plan. Now, a grandfathered plan, operates, just like any other health insurance plan, except that because it was potentially in existence before the Affordable Care Act, it's grandfathered in to some of its own policies. That basically means a grandfathered plan might not have to comply with all of the rules and regulations under the Affordable Care Act. So in this instance, if you do have a grandfathered health insurance plan, and by the way, if you're not sure, your insurance company is required to tell you whether your plan is grandfathered. But if you have a grandfathered plan and you live in one of these states that has a requirement for insurance policies to cover routine costs of clinical trials, then your health insurance policy would still have to follow the state law, even if it's not governed by the Affordable Care Act. So, things that are not covered or not required to be covered by your insurance policy post-ACA would be the investigational treatment or device itself. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If a pharmaceutical company is trying to test out new drugs, they wouldn't put it on the patient to actually pay for the drug during that clinical trial, right? Usually the study sponsor is the one that's going to be paying for those new treatments. Other things that are not covered, items or services solely for satisfying data collection and analysis needs, and then any service clearly inconsistent with standards of care. So when we're talking about routine costs that are covered by insurance that are associated with clinical trials, let's give an example. So let's say your insurance would cover 2 scans per year, but the clinical trial requires CT scans or maybe an MRI every other month for data collection and analysis. So if your insurance was already going to cover 2 of those, your insurance would still have to cover 2 of the scans, but the additional 4 that you might need over the course of the year, if you are going to be enrolled in that trial for a year, the additional 4 scans would have to be covered by the trial. They wouldn't be covered by your insurance company. So clinical trials under Medicare. The ACA does not affect Medicare coverage of clinical trials. Medicare already covered the routine costs related to clinical trials and will continue to cover those costs. Again, Medicare cannot discriminate against a patient for participating in a trial, and regardless of whether you have a Medicare Advantage plan, Original Medicare, or any other Medicare plan, you would have the same coverage with respect to clinical trials. And just as with private health insurance, if you have Medicare and you are enrolling in a clinical trial, the same sort of things would not be covered. So the item or service itself, unless it's covered outside of the study, Medicare would not have to pay for the costs of that new drug or new device. Medicare also would not cover items or services solely for satisfying data collection and analysis needs, free items, co-pays and deductibles, that sort of thing. Now, when we're talking about Medicaid, which is, a federally funded but state-run program for people who have low income, there is actually no federal law requiring coverage for clinical trials under Medicaid. The ACA clinical trials coverage provision does not apply to Medicaid plans, but ASCO, as I mentioned before, supports a lot of legislative initiatives that promote access to clinical trials under Medicaid. There are some state Medicaid programs that have written regulations or statutes or policies that require coverage. And the list is fairly short, so I will list it here. So the states that currently have some sort of policy regarding clinical trial coverage are Alaska, California, District of Columbia, Indiana, Iowa, Maryland, Montana, North Carolina, Texas, Vermont, and West Virginia. Other states might have unwritten policies, but if you live in any of the other states and are concerned about Medicaid coverage for clinical trials, I encourage you to reach out to your state assembly people or senators. So what if your insurance denies coverage for the clinical trial? First, you should contact your healthcare team to see if they can assist you. And you might also want to contact your insurance company to find out why they denied coverage. It's important to go through the insurance internal appeals process if you are denied coverage. And then potentially, you might need to contact your state insurance agency to see if you're eligible for an external appeal process, also known as an independent medical review. And I really want to flag here that I'm not going to go into much more detail about insurance appeals because we do have some really great resources available on our website. We have a step-by-step guide to insurance appeals on cancerlegalresources.org. But hopefully your healthcare team and or the study sponsors will be able to provide some assistance if you do need to appeal the insurance company's decision. So with the last little bit of time that I have here, I wanted to go over a couple of things for accessing experimental treatment outside of a clinical trial. We sometimes hear from patients who are not able to enroll in a trial, and there might be a number of reasons for why that is. Maybe there are no trials currently recruiting new patients for the type of cancer that you have. Maybe there aren't any trials at all. Maybe you're not in the age range being tested, or you have one of your organs isn't functioning well enough to qualify. And then sometimes we hear from people where the trials are only available out of state or in another part of the state and are too logistically challenging to get to or deal with. So if you're unable to get access to a newer experimental treatment through a clinical trial, there might be some other options available to you depending on your specific situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about expanded access, which is also known as compassionate use, right to try, which has been huge in the news lately, and then also off-label drug use. So expanded access is a program that's run by the FDA, which provides a venue to access experimental drugs outside of a trial. When a patient is unable to use the investigational medicine or the new drug as part of a trial, patients might be able to receive the product when it's appropriate through expanded access. So the process for going through expanded access is that your doctor has to submit an application, and the doctor also has to determine that there's no other type of treatment that would help treat your condition. You'd have to be aware of the probable risk for taking the new medication, the FDA then has to determine that there's enough evidence that the medication is safe and effective. The sponsor, which is the company or the company developing the medication, has to agree and provide a clinical protocol so that the doctor knows how exactly to use the new drug. And the patient has to be unable to obtain the drug through participation in the clinical trial. Patient safety is really the #1 priority here when it comes to expanded access. So the FDA has to determine the potential risk justifies, the potential benefit justifies the risk, and that the risk is reasonable in the context. So even with safeguards, there are always risks and unknowns about safety and effectiveness for new drugs. The thing about expanded access, so 2 things. First, the FDA cannot require a company to provide an investigational drug for compassionate use access. It really provides a mechanism for requesting access, and then there's oversight from the FDA with respect to safety, and risks and benefits. All of that being said, in a report on the expanded access program in 2017, the FDA noted that it approved 1,831 of 1,842 applications, which is more than 99%, for expanded access through special applications and protocols. So really the issue is that, with respect to expanded access, I think maybe just not enough people know that this process exists, because generally speaking, as you can see from these statistics, the FDA approves almost all of the requests that are made. So right to try legislation has been in the news a lot over the last several months. President Trump mentioned it during his State of the Union address in January, and it was finally signed into law last month. Right to try is a little bit of a misleading name. So it gives terminally ill patients the right to request to use experimental medications that have not yet been approved by the FDA. The law actually doesn't require physicians to prescribe the experimental therapies. It doesn't require insurance companies to pay for them. And it also doesn't require manufacturers to provide them. The bill basically is intended, or the law is basically intended to encourage drug makers to more freely provide more experimental medicines by limiting the liability that they would have, if there are maybe negative side effects. I would say that this is that the name of this is misleading to consumers and might give false hope because, again, there's nothing in this law that actually provides real rights. Patients already have the right to request access to experimental medication under expanded access. And because over 99% of those requests are approved, as Dr. Carlson from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network said, this new law is designed to solve a problem that does not exist. Many ethicists and doctors and patient advocates actually quite emphatically oppose this new law. And ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and over 40 health organizations, including the Cancer Legal Resource Center, sent a letter in February to Congress reminding legislators that the current regulatory system was created as a result of serious harm and exploitation that happened in the past. Some of that dark history that we've already talked about. Just one little excerpt from the letter that we sent to Congress said that birth defects resulting from thalidomide are an example of what happens when drugs are given to humans without proper safety review and approval. So I'm not really sure what the outcome is going to be when people start trying to use this right to try option. There's a lot of concern that basically keeping the FDA out of the loop is going to really negatively impact patients and patient safety. There already is legislation in about 40 states about right to try, but the state legislation differs substantially from this new federal law. So the last thing I wanted to go over here in my couple of remaining minutes is the idea of off-label drug use. So off-label drug use is when someone is prescribed medication by a physician that is used to treat a condition other than what the medication is approved to treat by the Food and Drug Administration, or intended to treat by the pharmaceutical company that makes the drug. So off-label means that you're using the drug in a different way than suggested on the drug label. So taking the medication for a different illness, using different doses than intended, or taking it in a different form than listed on the label. So one example that maybe a lot of women might be aware of is, we hear about birth control, for example, being prescribed to people who have really bad PMS or acne or, some other use than simply preventing pregnancy. So that's a pretty common off-label drug use. Doctors will often prescribe off-label drug use when they believe that it will treat the patient's condition more safely and effectively than another approved treatment. So it's legal for them to prescribe it. It's very common in cancer treatment because many cancer drugs are effective against more than one form of cancer, and because many treatment plans involve the use of multiple drugs. However, doctors might not want to prescribe off-label medications because it does carry a bit of a risk if the patient experiences an adverse reaction to taking the off-label medication. The biggest hurdle that we hear from patients about accessing off-label drug use has to do with insurance coverage. So coverage of off-label prescription drugs is often pretty challenging. Many insurance companies are not willing to pay for medication used in an unapproved manner and has the right to deny payments for off-label use of prescription medication. Most health insurance plans will cover off-label cancer treatments if the off-label use is listed in an approved summary list called a compendium. A compendium is a list put together by medical experts that have researched off-label uses of particular drugs, and you should be able to find out whether your insurance policy covers off-label drug use. If you're really struggling to access the medications that you need that are being prescribed as off-label, certainly you can always reach out to the pharmaceutical company directly to see if they have discounts or can provide samples. Sometimes there are coupons. We have on our website a couple of different fact sheets and publications about prescription drug access and prescription drug assistance programs. So those are also definitely worth looking into. Okay, so I was able to get through it with about 1 minute to spare. I'm going to end the recording now, but I'm happy to open it up if anyone has any questions.